The journey is conversations with ordinary people about stories of transformation and how we may have had setbacks in our life and how we persevered through those, how we've learned from those obstacles, and how they've maybe helped us on our path today. Well, welcome to the journey. My name is Kevin Polkey, and I am the host of the journey. And we have a friend of mine returning back to the journey for this particular episode, Ashley Phillips, who is a social worker in the Rockford area. She had just started about a year and a half ago. Had started her own agency called Becoming Free Counseling, and she's doing really well with that, making an impact within the community. So, Ashley, thank you for being back on the journey.
Yes, thanks for having me, Kevin.
And so, even though I know you just recently were on the journey, for any new listeners, what is Ashley when you have the opportunity to have fun? What do you do for fun?
My first go-to is being outside, is usually the things that I love to do is be out in the sun. I would say for a new thing, my husband and I just recently got a Miata a couple weeks ago, and it's something he's been wanting for a long time. And we just got it a couple weeks ago, and it's been really nice just to take some, back roads and just drive around with the top down and still enjoy being outside in a different way.
Nice, nice. Yeah, we just Diane and I and Dylan and Rob just got back from a trip out east, and we were driving from Boston to New York City, and and I didn't realize that stretch as you're going through Connecticut, how beautiful it was, and in my mind as we were driving, I had pictured myself in like in a movie, right? That individuals that maybe living in New York City and all the buildings and everything like that, where they would drive in a convertible up a little bit farther north and be able to have the top down and enjoy that. So I was thinking the same type of thing of how that must be pretty nice.
Yeah, it is, especially this time of year. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. So I know this month is something that you're very passionate about sharing some messaging about. This is we know Michelle was on just recently for Breast Cancer Awareness Month, but it's also Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and so tell us a little bit about why is that such a something that you're passionate about raising awareness and educating people on.
Sure. So I think the big part of that is just having gone through it personally. I would say it started with that relationship that I referred to back in the last podcast when we were 14. But really didn't really start noticing those things until later on in our relationship. I would say if I kind of talk a little bit about it, the day that I left that relationship, I really wasn't even planning on leaving. I remember being at work that day and kind of feeling sick to my stomach and anxious about even having to go to the house and say I just wanted a night away. Um, and that led into all these different things that prevented me from just leaving right away, right? Um, so that situation, I remember my family really encouraging me to get an order of protection. And I remember feeling like that is an overreaction to what just happened, even though I was trying to call 911 to leave the situation. So it's kind of interesting to think about it now that I'm out of that. Um, but what had happened was they really encouraged me to. The next day, I ended up going to the courthouse to file for one, and um, well, they directed me to WAVE, which is now Remedies, Renewing Lives, which is the local domestic violence agency. So they were in the courthouse and they helped assist me with filing the order of protection. But before they did that, one of the things that I found that was really helpful for me is that they provided me with just some simple handouts, which I kind of think of as more education based.
Mhm.
Some of those things were like, have I been abused? What are signs of emotional, physical, sexual abuse, and also the cycle of violence? Probably some other things as well, but I remember those things really. Uh, I think when I first read those, it was very validating because I didn't really understand what was happening. I knew we had issues, but I think I thought of it as more of like, well, don't all relationships have issues? And what's the difference between that and something like this? I also remember feeling like if I didn't have bruises or I didn't have some significant evidence that I really wasn't really being abused. Um, so I do think like having that information really, like I said, it was really validating to have some kind of like language to put with it maybe. But then I think at the same time it was also a little bit more terrifying because the reality of that and realizing like this is not just an argument. This isn't just um like how healthy relationships work. And also the reality of if this is an abusive relationship, the longer you're in it, the more uh, potentially dangerous it can be. Um, so I went ahead and filed the order protection, and it was granted that. Um, and I think we went back, it was like 2 to 3 weeks later for the plenary order protection, which is when they would extend it to the 2 years. I did not end up getting that, or I don't even remember going to trial for it, but we had agreed to like a no contact order. And I think during that time, even just having no contact at all was what I really needed. It was, it gave me the space to kind of like regain myself back because I felt like I had lost pieces of myself throughout that relationship. It gave me a sense of being able to reestablish like clarity and uh, I would say my mind again, because I think a lot of the stuff that whether that was the emotional abuse or the gaslighting and stuff like that, you start to really question yourself. And so I don't know what would have happened if I didn't go and get that order protection that day. Because this wasn't the first time I left. And as you know, typically it takes what I can't remember if it's like 7 to 9 times before somebody will like not just leave, but officially break that. And this wasn't my first time leaving either. It was just the first time or the last time that I was like, okay, I'm going to take these next steps. And that was really the turning point for me to which kind of goes into the becoming free, right? To become free from that relationship. So so yeah, it's really important for me because I think if I didn't know that, I know that there's probably a bunch of other people that aren't familiar with it and may even just be doubting and questioning themselves like something doesn't feel right, but I can't pinpoint what's going on. Or I don't know, even just questioning themselves. And so I do think it's important to be able to provide some of that information to people.
And I think, Ashley, you bring up something that I'd like to get your thoughts about because I think you're right. I think there is a, m- a misunderstanding, lack of awareness, lack of education, because I think stereotypically we think of domestic violence almost exclusively as being physical violence, right? And then that physical violence being those extreme, in which we know that those do exist, and it very much can evolve into that the longer the relationship and the cycle of violence continues, and obviously that becomes much more much more scary regarding that aspect of it. But and I think this is what people don't also understand who have not experienced it is that, well, why didn't she just leave? Why doesn't he just go? He's not being physically restrained. Why she's not being physically restrained? And that in itself, I think there's this idea that, well, men can't be a victim of domestic violence, which we know is not true. I mean, so maybe talk a little bit about um, the evolution of that cycle of violence and then the psychological or the emotional piece. Because I think stereotypically we think of it just as physical. So maybe touch base a little bit on the psychological or the emotional piece.
Yeah. And I think you're right that a lot of people do think about it as physical. And I will say, even for myself, the physical abuse that I did experience, I still minimized. I still was like, well, it's not like it was life threatening. It wasn't in some of those, as you're talking about, more of those extreme or severe cases. And so I think because of that, um, it was still hard to identify. But I do think the emotional abuse is really important. I wish that well, I know we can go into this a little bit too about like the court system and my experience there, but I really wish that the emotional abuse was taken just as seriously, because it, to some extent, I don't know how to explain this completely, but I think with the emotional abuse, it's left you feeling like it definitely chips away at your self-esteem and your confidence, which also furthers the abuser to kind of keep you stuck in that, because you don't trust your own judgment anymore. I remember being in some of these situations where I would bring about, I don't know, a concern that I had, to my significant other at the time. And somehow it would turn around to I was the one getting blamed and it was my fault and it was my problem. And over time, I started to believe that because, well, I'm the one reacting. I'm the one that's angry. I'm upset because of something that's happened. And as I'm bringing this up, he seemed fine, right? And so you do really start to question, like, is this just me? And I do think the emotional abuse when I'm working with people too, I find it's very common to not only blame ourselves because that blame shifting has happened, or if there are some of those things, then I don't know how many times people are like, well, they brought this concern. So people that are healthy, I think, tend to look at their own issues and take accountability for that. But people that aren't, it's never really their fault. And so what I find is like victims or survivors will typically still be like, well, if I just do this, then this won't happen. And you see where that slowly starts to chip away at who you are as a person. I remember, and some of these things weren't even really um outwardly like controlling, but I remember some of the situations where there were comments made about, well, you look better when you're not wearing makeup, or some guy would look at me while we're out in public and it would turn into this big issue that I was potentially cheating on them, when I'm like, I literally am just walking across, like, in the same place as you are, right? And so it really started to change how I presented myself. I stopped wearing makeup. I stopped wearing clothes that would bring attention to me. Um, I I basically, I mean, even friends, I remember some of those things that I would stop engaging with some of my friends because those would become issues too. And so the emotional abuse, it starts to chip away at all of those aspects of like who you are, I think in general, right? And so those things can be part of that. But I think the scarier part was when it became a constant, like, ridicule, criticism, chipping away at who I was as a mother, how I am as a person, how everybody else is going to see me. And that really kind of controlled some of that stuff there too. So,
In your experience, and you maybe alluded to this just a little bit, in your experience over time, did you experience have like a the word that's coming to my mind is like alienation,
mm,
meaning like wanting your circle of family, friends, activities outside of just like
mhm,
basic things that you do. Did you find yourself that getting smaller and smaller?
absolutely. I think isolation is one of those tactics that abusers will use. And so even though they didn't necessarily, and he probably did at one point say, I don't want you hanging out with these people. But it was more about the fights that would come up if I were to spend time with them. And so I would slowly stop spending time with friends, right? Particularly male friends. But then it turned into anytime we would have an issue and my parents, or whether that's family or friends, would bring anything to attention that would um kind of go against him still having that power and control over me, it would turn into that they're just uh they just don't want us to be happy, or they're just jealous of our relationship and they really don't want you to be happy. And so it really started having me question, like, who were my supports and who was really for me? And I think those things started to isolate. Plus, I think some of the behaviors that were happening too, people just naturally kind of maybe stepped back and we didn't really engage as much. But I will say, fortunately for me, I feel like I had a lot of people that saw what was happening and were the people that really stuck it out with me over those years until I got that order of protection and continued even after that. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think, I've talked about this before with people, is that, the idea that if this would have happened on the very first date or the very first week of dating, there's a very strong possibility we would have been like, oh, what's wrong with this situation, and wouldn't go for a second date or whatever. But it usually doesn't start that quickly. It's usually what we refer to it at Remedies as like a grooming process, or almost like a courting process, where the person is very charming and very much talking about how special things are, and that over time, it's what I've heard is when people will explain is that this is how our relationship is special and unique, and bring out the best in the person, and then there's this reliance on almost on the perpetrator. and
Mhm.
and so, like you said, then you start relying on that relationship and doubting your own thinking when it goes, okay, this is a red flag, but oh, maybe it's not, and then it's in jeopardy of losing this special relationship, even though it has problems.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think, when I think early on, I mean, honestly, I I didn't even want to be in a relationship with him, but he was pretty persistent, and over time I was like, "Okay, like whatever," right? So, and again, we were 14. So, some of those things to kind of keep in mind, but I do think that at one point he made me feel like I was the most important person and the most loved person, and like, there were those things, the charm and all of those things that kinda went into that earlier on, and then it slowly, and I think this is where it's confusing with the emotional abuse particularly, because I remember even just recently, like, trying to figure out, like, the things that I loved about him eventually shifted to all these problems. And so the part of, and I think this is, I think hope is a good thing, but hope in this situation can be not a good thing, right? It can lead to you experiencing more potential abuse and harm down the road, because the hope is that things will change because you saw this version of this person. So
Mhm.
why can't I just get that back? And I remember even being in some of when I was going through my addiction classes, seeing a lot of parallels between addiction work and being in an abusive relationship, because it's almost kind of like chasing that first high. When we talk about an addictions work, is like the person that's in this relationship is still chasing that person that, well, there's potential and that it was good. So why is it not good anymore? And what did I do to cause that to not be good? And that is totally not what's going on, right? Because if when we recognize the idea of the power and control being involved in these relationships, that it had nothing to do with you. It was really about that grooming and that cycle of abuse. So, yeah.
Well, and I remember early on in I mean, early 90s, when I was working at Oakwood Hospital, And I went to, this is when Chief Judge Agnew was petitioning for the Winnebago County court system to have a domestic violence court, specifically just for domestic violence, because in the 80s and before, there it was just part of the general court system. And he was the one who brought that to the Winnebago County area. And I remember there was, we were at back where the casino is now. That was a place called the Clock Tower Inn, and we were there, huge conference there, and there was hundreds of us that were involved either with the court system, behavioral health, the medical profession being involved. And the keynote speaker was a lady from, I don't remember her name, but she was from a southern university that she worked at, and she had specialized in domestic violence. And she gave this great example that still stands out to me, that of all these correlations of why a perpetrator perpetrates, but she said at the end of the day, these are all correlations or possibilities, but she believes in her research the only reason why perpetrators perpetrate is because they want that control, and they've identified someone that will allow them to do it.
Mhm.
And go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say as you bring that up, one of the things that I think myself and other people that I know have struggled with and that is identifying that power and control is the issue because, in my situation, he had mental health and addiction issues. And so the idea that if you could just deal with that issue, that would no longer be abused. I would no longer, there wouldn't be these issues. And that is really not the case. I mean, it can potentially add to the problems, but I don't think that's the root cause of that. And so again, goes back into why, as you ask, like why don't they leave potentially in some of these situations, um, is is because there's got to be something that's going on that we can remedy and get, change. And then that way we can get back to where we were before at the beginning of the relationship when we were in that honeymoon phase.
Well, and I think to your point earlier is that as you're attempting to make a relationship work, and the person is wanting more time with you, then more things become sacrificed.
Mhm.
I haven't hung out with my friends now for a blank amount of time. So, well, I don't have any friends. They don't call anymore. Or maybe it's family, or maybe it's, just go to work and I leave and I don't necessarily get involved with work activities or whatever it may be. And so then it ends up almost like all dependency is on that person, and it's even harder to break away, because now I have to, if I do leave and that's the reason, then I don't want to admit that I was wrong this whole time. I think there's all these variables that I play into it that make it, to your point, make it a lot more complicated than just going and filing an order of protection, or just moving out, or whatever it may be.
Well, and I think you know as well as I do, being in this field, that when somebody leaves, that's the most dangerous time.
Right.
And so sometimes people stay because it's safer,
Yeah.
unfortunately, to stay in that. And so I think it really depends. And this is why, as I talk about my experience, whoever listens to this, if you're in that situation, I really hope that you seek professional help with that because it's definitely safety planning that needs to go into that and factoring in your own, unique situation regarding that as well. Because it can be, and it doesn't stop. In my case, just because I left when I didn't have the contact, that was really the break that I got from it for the most part. But it didn't go away. Because yeah, at some point we didn't have that no contact order, and yeah, it still continued. So yeah.
And I think that's a great point, and especially if there's children involved, if there is, property that are involved, if there's other things that are tying that relationship together, which of course would be a natural part of being in a relationship with someone. And so I think it does make it more complicated. And I think this is probably a good time for us to, mention that, Remedies does an outpatient, providing outpatient services and consulting services, as well as it's the only domestic violence shelter that is free for individuals that are being abused, and family members as well. If they have children, they can go there. And then the Family Peace Center are the two main organizations. Now, like Four Corners and Becoming Free, there's a lot of counseling agencies that are trained in working with individuals that are victims of domestic violence or are impacted by domestic violence. But those are the two, probably their primary focus is Remedies, which used to be Wave, and now the Family Peace Center. Um, let's talk a little bit about the different aspects of, we obviously we there's different aspects of the psychological part of sexual violence. It could be obviously it could be the violent act of it, but it also could be a way of uh, using sex as or intimacy as like a weapon, meaning like withholding from, or this idea of the other person, the victim, not feeling good enough. And I think similar to financially, with financial abuse, some it could be restriction of, only given a certain amount of money to pay bills or certain things like that. But what other ways could financial abuse be happening besides just restriction of giving, allowing the person to have money? What comes to mind for you?
Well, I don't know if this is a good example, but one of the things that I think of, being involved in the court system, I think that there was some level there because I don't even know how this happened, but I was ordered to pay the entire GAL fees when we were involved in court. And I remember I didn't hear it, but somebody told me that they heard him say this when we had our court date, that he's going to take me for all I'm worth. And so I think even using the court system can be kind of that financial piece, because if you can't afford it or there's other things there, then that kind of keeps you stuck as well. But I think whether that's withholding money or preventing you from being able to work, which is I think a big part of that too, is that isolation piece, keeping you at home. Then there's less people to have influence over you or for you to see that these things are not okay. But I do think that could also be another area of the financial aspect.
And without a doubt, I think, an element that comes to mind of a couple different cases that I'm thinking of, clients that I worked with, where these were individuals, they were master level, professionals that were working, and their partner, the abuser, was maybe not as educated, not as, the money that was coming in wasn't the same, and it was never enough. It was never, you're not making enough. If you worked harder, if you and and there was, again, this, I think you said earlier, this chipping away of the self-confidence, the self perception, their own perception of themselves, was this idea of you know I'm doing as much as I possibly can under the circumstances, getting promoted, all these different types of things. But instead of coming home and it being celebrated, it was, yeah, but, and I think that part of the psychological aspect of it, again, still wanting to please the perpetrator, or minimally not have the perpetrator be upset,
Hmm.
get a really confusing line. Um, and so I, I I think that is many different tools, weapons in domestic violence that we don't necessarily always think of in this power and control, the cycle. Because it doesn't have to necessarily be this idea of it always being physical to keep someone controlled. right? And
Absolutely.
we think what comes to mind is the the idea that if you train an elephant when it's a baby elephant and they have a chain on their leg to keep them, from wandering around, and it's put a stake in the ground, the baby elephant can't move the stake, can't, do that. But over time, because it learned early on that they weren't able to move the stake or break the chain, even though they get bigger and stronger, the same chain keeps them still secured, controlled by the handler. And I think in some ways, metaphorically, that's what happens in domestic violence, in the cycle where it's the same. It's this. I thought I could get away. I thought I could, I thought I knew what was right, and now all of a sudden I don't even know which way's up.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I think the other thing too is like I know some people are familiar with like gaslighting, which is that emotional tactic, right? The emotional abuse tactic. And there were things that could be, how do I say this? So like I remember him holding a beer in his hand and saying that that's not happening, right? Like I legitimately see this, but he denied that that was happening. That was a way for me to, I could clearly see that. But how many times were there other things that were said that I couldn't, I couldn't like, go back to the evidence to say that this really didn't happen, where you start to question your judgment, you start to question your mind and all of those things. And so as you're talking about all of those kind of that chain, you again, you can go, but there's all these other things that kind of go along into that too.
Yeah, and I think that again, the idea, like you said, the idea of planting those seeds of doubt of a person's own ability to think, and their own recall of history, their own recall of what did they see, what did they experience, or like you said, the blaming or the shifting. If you wouldn't have done this, then I wouldn't have had to react this way.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And so I think all those things are part of it. And when you think of for you, and again, each person's different, every situation is different. Um, and I think sometimes, this idea that, well, maybe he'll, in this case, in your case, maybe he'll just leave, right? Maybe he'll just move on. The odds are, if he's the only way he's going to move on is if you no longer are playing the role of allowing, the role of the part that you were playing, right? But the odds are they're not going to leave because they've invested too much emotional energy into curating this, right? And so for you, what do you think, looking back on it, was the final thing that allowed you or pushed you to go file that order of protection, which then really gave you the space to be able to not have that contact and be able to think and see things differently? What for you was that kind of like tipping point or
Yeah, I don't even think there was that tipping point. I remember sometimes there were those conversations, especially when you think of the threats of, because this can go along into this too, right? That they will threaten to hurt themselves if you leave and they can't live without you and all of that, right? Which puts a lot of responsibility on you. But I remember feeling like I'm not living. I am dying if I stay in this. And so I think that that's probably a big part, but I don't even think that was a turning point. I think it really took my family pushing and my friends pushing and continuing to support me, um, despite my confusion about the relationship, right? Or my uncertainty about should I be in this relationship or not. I really think it was them that pushed me. Because like I said, even walking into the courthouse that day, I was like, I feel this isn't over. exaggeration to an overreaction to what is going on here. Um, and I do find that that is the case a lot with victims or survivors of abuse, that we probably underreact a lot more than we overreact, but we're being told that we are overreacting. And so I think that that also holds us back because we don't want to be that person, that's exaggerating this thing. It's not really that big of a deal, when you compare it to other situations, but it is a big deal. So I think that really that education that I got that day was what solidified it, even though I think that helped me potentially like rationally look at it, even though emotionally I wasn't really ready to take that step. But it helped push me to get to a place that I was able to be emotionally ready to be done with that. So,
Right.
yeah.
Well, and I think you made then the example of there's this tendency that the victim or the person who's a victim in the cycle underreacts, but is being blamed for overreacting. And again, the causes this doubt, and but there's probably this propensity to underreacting all along,
Mhm.
and in probably in a lot of things in their life, not just the relationship. And so it's kind of like, when individuals, if to have for someone to be, we talked about addiction, for someone to continue to be in the midst of their addiction, they're going to have to identify who is going to enable them to do that, and lean heavily into those enablers and not the ones that are constantly putting the mirror up in their face.
Mhm.
And I think it also, there's this pairing that happens with domestic violence as well. And so I
Mhm.
think that it falls into both. So,
Mhm.
so Ashley, for the ones that are listening today, or the ones that, someone may share this with someone who they think it could be helpful for, what would you want to have them, if there's one thing that you would want them to take away, or one thing to know, what would you want them to know?
Um, well, if I'm speaking specifically to the victims or the survivors, I would want them to know that it's not your fault, that you don't deserve to be treated that way, and there's nothing that you have done or can do that would justify for somebody to treat you that way. I hope that if they are questioning their relationship, or have any gut feelings, even though they don't have the clear answers as to what's going on in their relationship, if they're listening to this and can resonate to any of the things that I'm talking about today, that I hope that they take a step of just even talking with somebody, whether that's somebody at Remedies or a therapist or somebody that can just help them, I guess, identify, are these red flags or are you in an abusive relationship? So then that way they can potentially get help. There is help available. Um, and so I think like you brought up Remedies, the Family Peace Center. I know legally there, well, this is also, I think, part of the Family Peace Center too. Prairie State Legal can also help if they're in a financial situation that they need help with the court system. The other thing I would say is that to prepare for anything like that. I know we didn't really get into the court stuff today, but document as much as you can, and also build a team for that support. Because if you're in counseling, whether that's you or your kids, the therapist can be an advocate and a voice for you in the situations that you feel like you can't. Also, I would say, if you're in the court system, finding attorneys and, the ones that understand what's going on here, can also be helpful in helping you navigate that process. And I will say, I think to the professionals, I think we all, whether that's us or attorneys or whoever else is helping these people in these situations, that I think we need to believe them, and we need to do everything within our power to advocate and protect. So that's, I think that's a big thing because people that are in those situations, they really need people to stand up for them and advocate for them.
Very much so. And you know, you you named your counsel agency Becoming Free, and I think of the idea of that, what is freedom? And an aspect that comes to my mind of freedom is the ability to have choice. And yes, part of choice is to stay put and not change out of fear of the unknown. But freedom, in the sense of having choice to be able to go into the unknown and have the courage to go into the unknown and create a world that may be completely different than you're experiencing, especially if you're being restricted. So, Ashley, as always, I appreciate you being here. I know on November 7th, we're going to be doing a training at Four Corners on this topic. We're going to have a couple of the staff from Remedies will be coming to Four Corners and on that Friday morning to be talking about domestic violence as well as human trafficking. And so look forward to seeing you and your team there as well. And again, thank you for being on here, being on the journey again.
Yeah,
For
thank you so much.
anyone, yeah, for anyone that this may have, either for yourself or for someone that you love or care about, please pass this message on, this particular episode on, to hear Ashley's story of her being a survivor and then now thriving to have a life that maybe a few years ago, or longer than that, that didn't even imagine. And so, and having known Ashley as long as I've known her and watched her journey, it is a pretty amazing journey. So again, thank you for being here, and I look forward to being with you next week.